Thank you, Nessa. Oh, that's a bit louder than I was expecting. Another bit. I'm going to talk about carrier screening. It's light. It's the light version. It's not the kind of heavy-duty technical version. So if you're working in IVF, I'm guessing you two are. But I go, oh no, we're going to shake it the head. Okay, I'm going to make you think twice if you're not offering carrier screening. That's really the point of this talk. Okay. So 5 reasons why. There's probably hundreds of reasons, but let's stick with 5. So reason 1, if your clinic is offering donor gametes, I'd love to do shows of hands, but there's only 2 of you, so the focus is massively on you. Do you offer donor gamete services in your clinic? If you do, you really need to think carefully about carrier screening, right? For lots of reasons, I don't think this pointer is going to be really bright, but over here on the left, professional recommendations for donors. There are a number out there. I've put one example, but there's many. They're being developed all the time. And by carrier screening, I'm generally speaking about expanded carrier screening now, doing more than a few genes, okay? But the principle is the same. And then there's local regulations for donors, so not necessarily professional guidelines, but for example in the UK, and I don't want to be UK-centric at all, but that's the market I'm operating in, the 𝗀𝗿𝗿𝗶𝗴𝗏, which is our regulatory body, stipulates in their code of practice you must offer some sort of carrier screening. In fact, it's very light. It's probably lower compared to many other countries, and I think that's a problem. But I'm not writing the guidelines. And as I've said underneath, what's the consequence of these things? Well, you can't ignore it. If there's a guideline, guidelines lead to support for legal cases. You need a reasoned response, and the risk is having a blocked donor or even an affected child if you're not screening a donor. You can't ignore local regulations because it's a commercial risk. You might be closed down or asked to stop doing that particular form of treatment. And then the other thing is, if you get a report from a donor bank, so they sent you a sperm donor, they've done the carrier screening, and there's a report. Most of the reports say reciprocal screening recommended, meaning the recipient of those gametes needs to be screened, or at least you need to consider it. Well, you can't ignore that either, because that risks looking clinically negligent. So whether you want to or not, obviously this slide is all about whether you want to or not, you kind of need to do it. And then I hate the idea that the only people we think about for carrier screening, particularly in the UK, are donors and their recipients. Why not autologous couples? Why not people who are IVF themselves? So all people, but in this context, people having IVF. So there are professional recommendations for couples, particularly out of the US. Carrier screening in the US is way bigger, and in the Middle East than it is in Europe, and particularly UK. But it's pretty hard to justify not offering a test if you're already offering it in your clinic. When you say, "Oh no, this test is for donors, not for you people having IVF," right? So those are my reasons on reason 1. And considerations, just very quickly, to find a provider for carrier screening, and this would apply to any of the slides that follow. You need a rational, robust solution to avoid what I call a genetics arms race. So imagine, I have a sperm donor come in, they're positive for a particular recessive gene mutation like cystic fibrosis, and if we don't test, if we test the recipient with a larger panel, so he may have only been tested with 20 genes, and now we say, oh yeah, I've got a panel here, 200 genes, contains CFTR, cystic fibrosis, that's fine, we'll do that. What if you find another mutation? Now you've got an arms race. Now I've got a mutation here that isn't matched over here. So this is a problem, and it's probably the #1 reason we get called in the UK right now. It's not for couples, it's for donors and recipients. So a more general question is, what's the appropriate panel size? So I've said, you've got 20 here, 200 genes here. The truth is, there is no consensus on this. I think some new documents are coming out. I think the extra recommendations are coming out very shortly. May help with that. May help with that decision, but there is no correct answer, so I'm not going to give you a correct answer today. But the important thing is to select the appropriate test for the recipient when you've got a mutation in gene X. I'm just calling it gene X, right? So there's 2 real ways you can do this. You can either say, donor had test from company A, let's use exactly the same test. Whether that's company A or Igenomix saying, we can create a company A test. That's a good solution. So it's as if you've done them together like a couple. Or, which I think is possibly clinically a little bit better, is focusing on the gene of interest. So let's use that cystic fibrosis example. We've got a mutation in that gene. Rather than saying, well, let's just do a panel, we're saying, I know for sure they have a mutation, that donor. So in the recipient, I want to be absolutely sure there isn't a mutation in the reciprocal gene. Okay? So we've got both of those options, and one of the reasons is because we're using a whole exome as our backbone. So we've got lots of options to delve into the material we've already got. And all of this, of course, needs to be supported by genetic counselling. We have one of our lovely genetic counsellors standing outside, so make sure you speak to her. But it's really important because this isn't, although you can buy carrier screening, off the shelf, off the internet, that's fine, but I don't think that's the way to provide the best medical care. I walked past, there's a station in London, I walked past it, you can buy a genetic test in WH Smith's, like a general retailer. It's ancestry test, but you get my point. It's not really a medical test. So reason 2, we want tests to be accurate, accessible, actionable and affordable, and they are today. I mean, maybe a few years ago you couldn't say this about carrier screening, but today you can definitely say that. So I said that our test, and I think it's somewhat unique amongst carrier screens because most of them are panel-based tests, looking at whole exome, so looking at all of the genes. It's got a low false negative, false positive rate. You would want that in any carrier screening test, obviously. The key here is testing only once. That's not specific to us, but why would you want to keep going back to people and say, I just want to look at a bit more information? It's comprehensive, but it's flexible. One of those reasons is because you can re-interrogate it. So let's say a recipient has tested against a donor, and she's found that she's negative, so that's fine. I'm talking about sperm donor here. And then she says, I want a new donor. Do I need to do a new test? No, we'll just unmask the data, have a look at that other mutation. Okay, so we can upgrade that way. It's very accessible because you just need to make a phone call and you can access this test today, right? Actionable, if you're using a donor, test the recipient. You don't need to exclude donors who are positive anymore. You could change your donor. Couples who get tested, so rather than the donor situation, can consider HDM or consider using a donor. So I think it's an important thing about what we offer at Igenomix. It's always like the tests we do, they're actionable. It's not, sorry, here's some bad news for you, go away and do something else. It's here's the solution, and in this case, we've got the solution in-house, HDM. We don't have a sperm bank yet, I can say. And it's affordable. I mean, we can argue about price and say, well, it could be lower, but the reality is people pay more for their baby strollers than they do for carrier screening these days. That's the truth. So I don't think price is the barrier anymore. I think knowledge is the barrier. Okay? And one of my colleagues has this beautiful phrase. He says, nobody Googles carrier screening, right? Well, we might, but patients don't. So if they don't Google it, they don't know about it, right? That's the reality. And this is a quote from a doctor. I'm not going to name him, but he says, the couples I see don't have a family history of cystic fibrosis and SMA, so why would I offer carrier screening? And that's ignorance, okay? Because actually, there's a lot of positive carrier frequency when there's no family history, as I'll show you on another slide. So I can feel the time ticking away. So I'll move on to reason 3, patients' right to know. This is kind of obvious. I don't really think I need to say this. But apart from the professional recommendations, which we shouldn't expect patients to read, because we're the ones getting paid to do the job, we need to follow those recommendations, and patients need to have a service that incorporates those recommendations. And I think you can ask yourself, would you want this testing? If you were at a reproductive age, you didn't have children at the moment, you said, I know all this stuff, I'm in this field, would I want the testing? It's okay for you to say, no, I don't want the testing, but you want to know about it, you want to know it exists, that's why you're here now. And you have to ask yourself the question, should your patient have a choice? We don't need to ask that question, we know what the answer to that is. Paternalistic medicine is dead, and we need to let people make their own decisions. And I'll talk about that more when we talk about risk. And, it's good to provide a lot of patient information, but also we've got clinics now who are saying, I'm including it in my consent form. You can call it the genie out of the box. Once you've raised that issue, not only do you need to tell people, you need to demonstrate that you told them, and if they said no, that's fine. They sign and they say no. But then you've got that documented, so they can't come back to you if there's a problem with a child and say, carrier screening, I didn't have it, and it was available in your clinic. Reason 4, diagnostic yield, rationale, and risk. Well, the top graphics are the rationale. Why would we even do it to begin with? So these are all, very well-known stats in the world of genetics. If you do a large panel test, you can argue this number can go up to 100%, but with our large test, 80% of people are carriers, including donors. So this isn't a case of, I wonder if we'll find a mutation. You're going to find it in 4 out of 5 people. There's the thing about family history. 88% of cystic fibrosis affected children have no family history. So that idea about, I don't need to test them because there's no kids already affected, that's just wrong thinking, it's ignorance. The global prevalence called a 𝗖𝗿𝗿𝗶𝗲𝗍 of genetic disease is about 1 in 100, so that's a decent number, and it's not for us in the healthcare profession to say, 1%, I'll take my chances. It's Mr. and Mrs. 1%, how are you with that? in our 10 chances, or no way, 1%, not doing it. And with these tests, I've given a broad range of percentage chance of getting a hit, let's say. It obviously depends on what size test you're doing, what ethnicity you're looking at, and so on, although they're pan-ethnic panels. But we're broadly sort of saying 1 to 5%. Now, when you think about that, that could be up to 1 in 20 couples that come through are at risk. That's certainly not a risk I'd want to take, 1 in 20. And if you go to a population where there's more consanguinity, that risk just goes up. And we've got lots of publications to demonstrate that. And 20% of infant mortality in developed countries down to genetic disease. So the rationale is really clear. We don't need to argue that point. But we do need to consider things like diagnostic yield. So you do the test, what's the chance of actually seeing anything? Because if we offer a test and we say, do it thousands and thousands of times and you never get hit, it feels like an insurance policy that you're being cheated on. Okay, I accept that, and I'll give you a good story about a clinic we worked with where we got a really good diagnostic yield. But when you consider NIPT, fastest growing genetic test ever, people don't think twice about doing NIPT. The diagnostic yield for carrier screening is generally speaking higher than it is for NIPT. So it's just about that education piece. You know, again, it's for patients to decide what they want to do. I'm not arguing against NIPT. I'm just saying, you know, the risk factor there is not so high that you go, you'd be stupid not to do it. Patient attitude to risk differs. We know that. We're all patients too. But you need to be aware of the risk to make an informed decision. It's not for us to say, oh, I don't think that risk is high enough to worry about, so I'm not going to tell you about it. That's dead. And a brief anecdote. There's a clinic we work with in one of the territories I manage, and we've done a couple of tests with them, and then we said, well, are you going to do a couple of tests? Because that was the offering they really wanted to do. They did a couple of tests. The very first test we did, paired test, was co-carriage for 𝗿𝗿𝗀𝗿𝗶𝗴𝗏 gene, which is Stargardt's disease, which is retinal degeneration, so a child goes blind. And, you know, some people would argue, oh, I don't know if that's really so severe, but I'm pretty sure most people wouldn't want to have a child who goes blind. So it's on the HVA has a list of approved diseases, and that's on the approved list, so it's met some legal requirements in the UK at least. So I just thought that's a nice story because, in a way, it sounds terrible, but I was very happy when we got that result because no bad thing has happened. What we've done is given people information and they've been able to make a decision. And in fact, they went on to have PGTM, so they took one of those options, actionable options. So we're on to reason 5. It's never been easier to access. I realise that sounds a bit like, you know, buying a vacuum cleaner or something, but it's never been easier to access. There's no excuse for not offering this. How do I order it? These are the common questions then. How do I order it? What samples do I need? Because, you know, I've worked with clinicians, I've worked in the lab, and when something new comes along, people always want to find a bit of an obstruction, a bit of a barrier, and I get it. You know, don't make my life more difficult. Well, we're not here to make your life difficult, we're here to make it easier. Will I understand the results? That's the big one, right? You know, oh, I'm not a geneticist, why would I want this report that's got 600 genes on it? Well, how do I order? Call, you get pre-test counselling, certainly in our affiliate will do. So you don't have to explain why you're doing the test, but there's lots of patient information and webinars available as well. Simple blood test. It's many companies, including us, do saliva and cheek swab. All I would say is, we learned this during the pandemic as well. You can't really mess up a blood test, but you can mess up a self-administered saliva test. Okay, so it works, but we need to make sure it's done properly, and blood is probably easy. And again, supported by genetic counselling. Who's going to explain the results? Well, hopefully not you, hopefully a genetic counsellor, and we can provide that. There's 2 of our lovely genetic counsellors. We have a genetic counsellor over there as well. She's lovely too. And as they say in Britain, on the BBC, where you're not allowed to advertise anything, they say other genetic counsellors are available. Okay, so we've got a whole team across the world. And finally, the 5 reasons why. I've already told you, but what better reason than, I mean, in the UK, several years ago, there were, I think, 5 CF births. Over a big number of cases. I'm not trying to say this is super common. 5 CF births and a couple of SMA births, I think, and then some other stuff. I'm just focusing on those top 2, if you like. And, you know, those children might survive, the top one might survive into their 40s or 50s. Bottom one, there's gene therapy available now, but, you know, that's not a good gig to have. And this is avoidable. And so this whole talk has been about, it's avoidable, so let's avoid it. Thank you very much.